There's something worth talking about in today's public conversations about faith and skepticism, something that often gets dismissed before it's even examined. When you listen to serious Christian scholars, people trained in history, philosophy, linguistics, and textual criticism, you'll often hear a tone marked by restraint, care, and intellectual charity, even when they're making strong claims. But when you look at much of the online atheist ecosystem, especially on platforms like YouTube, the dominant style is very different: dismissive, contemptuous, and often openly insulting toward anyone who disagrees. This isn't a question of who's right or wrong about God, it's a question of how arguments are made and why certain styles of discourse are rewarded. Somewhere along the way, ridicule replaced reasoning, confidence replaced competence, and winning applause became more important than seeking truth. The result is a culture where mockery is treated as intelligence and civility is treated as weakness. What I want to explore here is not whether atheists are immoral or Christians are superior. That's a shallow and unhelpful framing. What I want to examine is why scholarly traditions shaped by moral accountability tend to produce careful, decent discourse, while algorithm-driven skepticism often incentivizes hostility and rhetorical aggression. Because if we care about truth at all on either side, then the way that we talk matters just as much as what we believe. A discourse on scholarly decorum versus algorithmic contempt. 1. Christian scholarship is formed under moral restraint, not rhetorical license. Serious Christian scholarship is not merely an intellectual exercise, it is conducted under an inherited moral framework that governs how one speaks, not just what one claims. For centuries, Christian intellectual traditions have treated rhetoric as morally consequential. Words are not neutral tools, they are actions. This matters. From Augustine to Aquinas to modern biblical historians, scholars are trained to argue without annihilating their opponent's dignity. Not because opponents are always right, but because truth is believed to be independent of humiliation. Mockery is not a substitute for refutation, and contempt is not evidence. This produces a consistent pattern: careful qualification, willingness to admit uncertainty, separation of a person's worth from the validity of their claims. Even when the conclusions are strong, the posture is restrained. That restraint is not weakness, it is discipline. 2. YouTube atheism is structurally hostile to restraint. The dominant online atheist presence is not academic atheism, it is platform atheism, optimized for engagement metrics, not intellectual integrity. The incentive structure is explicit and brutal. Outrage increases retention. Ridicule drives virality. Certainty performs better than nuance. In this ecosystem, calm explanation loses to derision. A scholar who says this is complex will be buried by an influencer who says this is obviously stupid. Over time, the platform selects not for thinkers but for performers. This is why the tone skews harsh, not incidentally but inevitably, because the system rewards contempt. 3. Mockery becomes a functional replacement for argument. Once ridicule is normalized, it ceases to be a tactic and becomes a stand-in for reasoning. The audience is trained to interpret laughter as victory and insult as proof. A sneer replaces a syllogism, a joke replaces a citation. In this environment, calling an argument delusional substitutes for showing why it's false. Dismissing a scholar as indoctrinated replaces engaging their sources. Certainty is assumed, not earned. This is not skepticism, it is anti-intellectual theater masquerading as critical thinking. 4. Identity fusion escalates hostility. For many prominent atheist voices and their supporters, atheism is not merely a conclusion, it's an identity formed in opposition. Often formed out of conflict with religious authority, it becomes emotionally charged. As a result, criticism is not processed as intellectual disagreement, but as personal attack. Once belief positions are fused to identity, disagreement feels like insult, correction feels like domination, and civility feels like a concession. This is why responses escalate so quickly from argument to abuse. Their goal is no longer clarification, it is defense of self-image. Christian scholars, by contrast, are accustomed to dissent. Their worldview has survived centuries of critique. They are not shocked by disagreement, and they are not existentially threatened by it. 5. Absence of moral accountability degrades discourse. In Christian intellectual traditions, speech is accountable. ethically, socially, and often professionally. A scholar who behaves viciously risks reputation, credibility, and community standing. Online atheist spaces frequently lack any comparable constraint. There is no shared moral boundary on speech beyond audience approval. If cruelty generates applause, cruelty becomes virtue. This does not mean atheists lack morals. It means these spaces lack moral governance, and ungoverned rhetoric predictably decays. 6. Selection bias amplifies the worst voices. The most tactless voices are the most visible, not because they are the strongest thinkers, but because they are the loudest performers. Calm, careful secular philosophers exist. They publish, they teach, they debate respectfully. They're not the ones filling comment sections with insults. The result is a distorted public square where the worst behavior is mistaken for representative behavior. The visible atheist discourse is not the best atheism, it is the most clickable atheism. Intellectual traditions that impose moral discipline on speech produce better thinkers and better discourse. Why scholarly Christianity produces decorum and platform atheism produces contempt. In contemporary public discourse, especially online, a striking asymmetry has emerged in how belief and disbelief are argued. When one listens to trained Christian scholars, historians, philosophers, textual critics, theologians, their arguments are often delivered with restraint, precision, and a noticeable effort to separate claims from the character of those who hold them. By contrast, much of the popular atheist discourse circulating on platforms like YouTube is marked by sarcasm, ridicule, and overt hostility toward religious interlocutors. This contrast is not accidental, nor is it adequately explained by differences in intelligence, morality, or truth claims. It is the predictable result of formation, incentives, and institutional norms. There are a few exceptions. Christian scholarship developed within traditions that treated speech as morally significant. From its earliest intellectual foundations, Christian thought imposed ethical constraints on rhetoric itself. Augustine warned against winning arguments at the cost of truth. Aquinas modeled disputation that presented opponents' arguments as strongly as possible before responding. This inheritance persists in modern Christian academia, where scholars are trained to argue carefully, qualify claims, acknowledge uncertainty, and avoid reducing opponents to caricatures. The underlying assumption is that truth does not require humiliation to prevail. Contempt is viewed not as strength, but as a failure of discipline. The moral formation does not make Christian scholars correct by default, but it does shape how they argue. Their credibility depends not only on conclusions, but on method and posture. A scholar who mocks rather than reasons undermines his own seriousness. As a result, decorum is not ornamental, it is functional. It is a condition of intellectual legitimacy. The dominant atheist presence online operates under radically different conditions. What most audiences encounter is not academic atheism, but platform atheism. Content optimized for attention, engagement, and audience retention. The algorithm does not reward nuance. It rewards certainty, speed, emotional punch, and derision. Calm explanation loses to sharp ridicule. Careful argument loses to confident dismissal. Over time, this incentive structure selects for personalities who perform skepticism rather than practice it. Within this environment, mockery becomes a substitute for argument. A sneer stands in for analysis. Calling a belief delusional replaces demonstrating why it is false. Laughter signals victory where reasoning is absent. The audience, conditioned by repetition, begins to treat contempt as evidence of intelligence and sarcasm as proof of superiority. This is not skepticism in any classical sense. It is rhetorical theater that mimics critical thinking while bypassing its substance. Identity dynamics further intensify this pattern. For many prominent atheist figures and their supporters, atheism is not merely a philosophical conclusion, but an identity forged in opposition, often shaped by personal conflict with religious authority. In such cases, criticism of arguments is experienced as criticism of self. Disagreement feels like attack. Correction feels like domination. Under these conditions, civility is interpreted not as intellectual confidence, but as vulnerability. Hostility becomes a defensive reflex rather than a deliberate choice. Christian scholars, by contrast, generally operate within traditions accustomed to dissent. Their texts, doctrines, and historical claims have been scrutinized for centuries. Disagreement is expected, not destabilizing. As a result, criticism does not threaten identity, and debate need not escalate into aggression. Another decisive factor is moral accountability. Christian academic communities impose reputational, institutional, and ethical limits on speech. Scholars answer to peers, institutions, and traditions that regard cruelty as disqualifying rather than impressive. Online atheist spaces often lack comparable governance. There's no shared moral boundary on rhetoric beyond audience approval. If derision attracts views, it is reinforced. If cruelty generates applause, it becomes normalized. The result is not principled bluntness, but gradual degradation of discourse. Finally, selection bias distorts public perception. The most visible atheist voices are not the most careful or rigorous, they're the most performative. Serious secular philosophers, historians, and critics of religion exist in abundance, but they do not dominate comment sections or trend feeds. What the public sees is not representative atheism, but amplified atheism, the loudest, sharpest, and least restrained expressions elevated by algorithmic pressure. This contrast does not establish the truth of Christianity or the falsehood of atheism. It establishes something more basic and more troubling. Intellectual environments that impose moral discipline on speech tend to produce better arguments and better thinkers, while environments that reward contempt hollow themselves out. Ridicule corrodes reasoning. Certainty without accountability replaces inquiry. Over time, the performance of skepticism displaces skepticism itself. This is not a call for politeness or an appeal to emotional sensitivity. It is an argument about seriousness. Truth-seeking requires restraint. Scholarship requires discipline. Any movement, religious or secular, that abandons those constraints in favor of applause will eventually lose the very intellectual credibility it claims to defend. The issue, then, is not belief versus disbelief, it is formation versus performance. And the results are visible to anyone willing to look honestly at how arguments are actually being made. The divide observed between scholarly Christian discourse and much of contemporary online atheist rhetoric is not incidental, nor is it adequately explained by intelligence, education, or access to information. It is the result of fundamentally different formations and incentive structures. One tradition treats speech as morally weighty and argument as accountable to truth. The other, shaped by platform economics, increasingly treats rhetoric as performance and certainty as spectacle. The outcomes are predictable. Where moral restraint governs intellectual exchange, disagreement remains substantive. Where ridicule is rewarded, argument collapses into theater. Mockery does not sharpen ideas, it narrows them. Contempt does not expose error, it conceals the absence of reasoning. Over time, these habits do not merely degrade discourse, they deform the very capacity to think critically, replacing inquiry with applause cues and analysis with identity defense. This does not vindicate Christianity by default, nor does it indict atheism as a worldview. It exposes a more fundamental reality. Truth-seeking communities cannot survive without discipline, and skepticism cannot function without humility. Any movement that confuses derision for insight or volume for validity forfeits its claim to seriousness. The question then is not who holds the correct metaphysical position, but which intellectual culture is capable of sustaining honest inquiry over time. The answer is visible in the tone, method, and integrity of the arguments themselves. Where restraint endures, thought deepens. Where contempt reigns, thinking eventually stops.